Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Sometimes your guests get a little bit nauseous after riding the Skull Crusher 8000 and this causes them to reduce their walking speed to that of a snail with arthritis, and they will also empty their lovely stomach contents right on the path. Never beside it, not in a bin, not in the toilets, no, it's always in the middle of the path so that other people have the absolutely highest possible chance of stepping in it. Usually this doesn't last too long and throwing up or sitting down for a bit will make the nausea go away. But what if that didn't happen? What if the guests were always nauseous? For this video I made it so that the cheat that maxes out the nausea stat of every guest automatically goes off every 6.4 seconds, which means that they have absolutely no chance of ever feeling well. You may think this is very cruel, but I assure you it's not. It's merely their punishment for being alive. We'll start with just building a normal park in Forest Frontiers, the easiest scenario of all, and just see what happens. After building the mandatory merry-go-round, we get the first guest and they immediately choose to sit down on a bench on the very first bath tile. I didn't really know what to expect, I hadn't thought about it, but this definitely took me off guard a bit. It makes sense, of course, as that's just the thing that sick guests do. They don't actively seek out a bench, but if they come across one, they will sit down. The other guests that are entering the park will immediately join the fun and also take a seat. It looks like it's gonna be a while until my beautifully decorated merry-go-round is going to get any visitors. In the meantime, we can build the first roller coaster of the park, a classic mini coaster. Nothing special, just something nice where the entire family can be thrown left to right while desperately trying to not become a human fountain from either end. I did try to make it look a little bit nice by changing the colors and planting some trees, but I'm not sure how much the guests are able to appreciate that currently. If we look back to the front of the park, it's already covered in a fair bit of vomit and the benches are quickly filling up. Soon there will be no more space on them and the guests will be forced to continue walking and perhaps even go on my rides. And indeed, soon after we see the first guest that dares to go on the merry-go-round in their unstable state. I've also built a couple of food stalls, as guests do still get hungry and thirsty over time, even if all they do is sit their lazy butt down on a bench. At the end of March we have 3 rides with a little bit of decoration, and more than half of all the guests in the park are sitting down. I added some more benches and it's really nice to see them being appreciated so nicely. I really put a lot of effort into making these benches as uncomfortable as possible, and these guests are clearly enjoying that as they are all masochists. How do I know that? Well, tell me this, who would ever go to one of my parks without enjoying the feeling of suffering? They know what they can expect and yet they still show up, so I can only conclude that they must somehow like it. Despite that conclusion, the park rating is getting a little bit low, and a quick look at the Park Rating Inspector plugin shows that this is because the guests are somehow not very happy. Apparently, being sick causes that to happen, so it's not something we can easily avoid. We can counteract it though, by hiring some furries and making them dance in front of the guests. And it makes sense, I mean, who wouldn't get excited by having a massive anthropomorphic panda shake their furry booty in their face? I know I would. Okay, it's time for a big roller coaster, a classic wooden coaster. This is similar to the standard wooden coaster we all know and love, but it's the RCT1 version, as Forest Frontiers is a scenario from RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. That means we cannot bank our sloped turns, and the normal banked turns are less banked than they would be in RCT2. Steep turns are also not available, and this all combined makes it fairly limited. You can still build a decent coaster with it though, and I'm quite happy with the final design, especially the big S-bend under this hill. There is a problem though. After completing the wooden coaster, I noticed that the junior coaster hasn't had a single rider yet. That's not because there aren't any guests around, and some other rides do have a bunch of people on them. The spiral slide, merry-go-round and Ferris wheel are all doing fine, but the swinging ship and junior coaster are still at 0 customers. This is when I remembered that very nauseous guests will not go on rides with either a nausea or intensity rating above a certain value. I don't know exactly what that threshold is, but I do remember it exists now. That certainly means that a wooden coaster will never get any riders either, as it will have the highest stats of all the rides in the park. Wooden coasters are quite intense. That's quite a shame and a bit of a waste of effort, but there's nothing we can do about it. Perhaps these guests will enjoy a flat circle of track a bit more. With every stat under 0.5, they surely will enjoy this, although since most guests in the park are sitting down, there will still not be very many customers. And what about this log flume? It's quite small, so surely it's not too intense. It's got 1.9 intensity and just 0.9 nausea, which is indeed enough, and guests are willing to ride this. I'm not sure I would want to ride it though, considering how many stomachs worth of food would surely be mixed in with the water of the flume. Ew. Speaking of puke, it's actually not a big problem in the park. Sure, there is quite a bit of it lying around, but the 7 handymen I have are able to clean it up quickly enough so that it never bothers the park rating. There is also less puke than there could be, as guests that are sitting down can keep it down. With dirty paths you are at risk for vandalism, but guests can only become vandals when the paths are dirty and the guests are unhappy. That second condition of being unhappy will never be met, as I have a big army of entertainers constantly artificially pumping the guests full of dopamine. At this point I realized that it was incredibly crowded near the front of the park. What on earth is keeping the guests around here? Clicking on one of them gave me the answer. They are hungry but are also unable to buy any food. You see, first they get hungry and go in search of food. It's not a very difficult search, but as soon as they reach the burger bar with money in their outstretched hand ready to buy some food, their bellies start to grumble and remind them of their sorry state, and they decide they'd rather not risk ingesting even more. This threshold is at 145 out of 255 nausea, and since our guests are locked at that 255, they can never buy any food. Their hunger does stay around though, causing them to be locked in an eternal state of going to the burger bar, not wanting to risk it, going back, still not risking it, and on and on and on, forever until the end of the universe. It's probably a good idea to remove these stalls so that the guests can actually go on some rides. The toilet can stay though, they do use that one. We have another problem, and that is that we are quickly running out of money. We're charging for the rides, which is usually fine, but with guests barely going on them and only going on the cheapest ones, this isn't a good source of income. So far we have made less than €250 from ride ticket prices. Luckily, in Forest Frontiers we can choose whether to charge for the rides or the park entry, so we can just make all the rides free and do the park entry instead. With a €40 ticket price, it's gonna take only 6 guests to eclipse all the ride ticket profit we have made. Now that we're making money again, I decided to go all in and just put benches on every single available path tile, allowing as many guests to sit down as possible. I'm going to fill up the entire front section of the park with paths and benches to make the largest seating area for sick guests that the world has ever seen. Quick side note, due to 2 recent additions to OpenRCT2, this is now easier to build than ever. Firstly, you can drag walls now, making it easy to build a long line of them. After building a couple of these lines next to each other, you can use the new path dragging tool to build a square of path on top of it. Remove the fences and you have a whole square of separated single wide paths, constructed faster than ever possible before thanks to these 2 new features in OpenRCT2. Big thanks to the developers for all their continued amazing work on this. And now back to Pukey Frontiers. If you look at the seating area carefully, you can see something interesting happening. A lot of guests will get up from their bench and then immediately sit down again. This is caused by their high energy levels. How long a guest will sit down for is determined by how much energy they have at the moment they sit down. Since guests gain energy while sitting, they all have that stat maxed out, resulting in them constantly getting up and sitting down again, as if they have just ingested an entire bag of sugar, making them incredibly hyper. Maybe that's what made them sick in the first place. At the end of July we have well over the required 250 guests, showing that the nausea will not prevent you from beating this rather easy scenario, even if you built just a normal park. Well, I don't know how exactly normal having this many benches is, but the park doesn't look too weird. Since there's nothing left to prove, we might as well start advertising so that we can fill up every single bench in the park. And it works! In October we have over 1,000 guests, of which more than half are sitting down. I also built another ride to see if the guests would go on it. This looping coaster has 2.8 intensity and 1.2 nausea, which apparently is still within the threshold of very sick guests. I looked it up after this playthrough and the limit for this is 1.4 nausea. The intensity rating doesn't matter, but when a guest has over 160 out of 255 nausea, they will refuse to go on any ride with a nausea rating of 1.4 or higher. That rules out pretty much any roller coaster and also every thrill ride except the go-karts. This looping coaster just barely has it low enough, but it's gonna be one of the extremely few designs that can do so without abusing stat penalties like we did with this flat circle. Despite this little nausea issue, we comfortably beat Forest Frontiers with over 1200 guests. But the video isn't over yet, as now I'm very curious what the other impacts of constantly nauseous guests are. Can you beat every scenario with this enabled? What are some wacky optimization strategies? And how much of a problem would the puke be without any benches? That last one is something we can immediately find out by just removing all the benches in this park. It's not good. There is now puke everywhere and it's actually quite funny watching the handyman trying to keep up, but utterly failing. Surprisingly, it's not actually a big problem for the park rating. That's because litter only affects the rating once it's been there for a few minutes, so as long as the handyman get everywhere at least once every few minutes, the park rating will be fine. Well, not entirely. While the puke isn't directly lowering the park rating, the guests are still getting unhappy both from the nausea and from the paths being a vomit slip and slide. This causes a lot of them to leave, and I mean a lot of them. The park is now so bad that if we fast forward a bit, we stabilize at only about 100 guests, or slightly more if we have a positive award active. Guests are unlikely to go on a ride before the deadline for that runs out, so a lot of them will leave after a few minutes if they haven't been on a ride yet. If they do go on one of them in time, they just get stuck at the ice cream stall that I built in the back so that I could advertise free food. They are desperately trying to satiate their insatiable hunger, but are never able to, and once their energy runs out, they too will leave. Okay, Forest Frontiers is doable, but what about a scenario that requires a lot more guests, like Amity Airfield? With all the optimization tricks and exploits, this is really quite easy. The queue line trap, where you trap thousands of guests between two no entry signs in a single queue line, still works just fine. But what if you wanted to build a normal park where you're not allowed to trap the guests in any way? Well, that makes it quite a bit trickier. I started building this park with every ride under 1.4 nausea, benches everywhere and the ad campaigns running at all times. The guest count is going up really quite quickly as advertising is overpowered, but the money does start getting tight the more we expand the park. That's because the more guests we have, the more handyman and entertainers we need, which is immensely expensive. I did decide to build some food stalls again, firstly to be able to run the free food campaign, but also because I thought having all the guests be occupied with trying to escape their hunger hell would help keeping them in the park. It does mean that there's a lot of overcrowding though, so we do need even more entertainers now. We do reach the goal of 3000 guests before we run out of money, but we haven't beaten it yet. It's only September year 2 and the goal requires us to have 3000 guests and 600 park rating at the end of year 4, not year 2. We do already have more than enough rides to attract the 3000 guests, so when we run out of money a few months later, it's not a problem. Yes, we will be in debt forever until the end of time and cannot advertise anymore, but that also means we can just go mad and hire hundreds of handymen and entertainers to keep everyone around. Who cares about even more debt? If everything goes well, we won't need to build anything anymore anyway. And that's exactly what happens. With 300 handymen, 500 entertainers and €500,000 of debt, we beat Amity Airfield. After this, I tried closing the food stalls and man, I should have just done that in the first place. Now the guests spread out over the entire park instead of overcrowding around a few food stalls, which means that we only need like 60 entertainers to keep the guests happy instead of the about 150 we needed before. One thing you are maybe wondering is, why on earth don't you build some first aid rooms? Wouldn't they help? Well, let's just see what happens if I place one. Of course, everyone immediately heads for it, making this super overcrowded and probably a massive health hazard. Yeah, we're all sick, but let's cram 1000 of us in a 3x3 meter room. That will totally help. The thing is though, they will never ever get out. When guests enter a first aid room, their nausea goes down rather quickly and once it reaches 35, they will leave. The problem is that it takes longer than 6.4 seconds to go down from 255 to 35, so before it can get low enough for them to leave, it gets reset to the maximum, meaning they will never leave. This leads to one of the funniest thoughts I have ever seen. I want to get out of first aid room 1. Usually this is impossible to get, but in this version, once they enter, they are stuck there forever. This seems like it's a great guest trap, but the problem is that they do become unhappy after a while, and entertainers do not affect them while they're in there. This will severely impact your park rating, although not necessarily ruin it. If you max out everything else, you can still get to 653, which requires some finicking, but it's not too difficult to do if you don't need to worry about satisfying the needs of your guests, as they are all stuck in a black hole of vomit and first aid. This 653 park rating is enough for most guest calls, as they require only 600. But there are also a bunch that don't allow you to ever let it fall below 700, and for those, this strategy will not work. That's not a problem though, as we have seen a normal park works fine too, except for extreme heights. Here, every guest has an intensity preference of 9 or higher, which, if they're the happiest possible, means that the absolute lowest they will ever go on is 6.55 intensity. At the same time, they will refuse to ride a ride with more than 1.4 nausea, and such a ride is, as far as I know, impossible. I could not find a way to keep the guests around in extreme height, as they simply will not ride any ride or even head for one. Well, that goes for a normal park. I believe that constantly nauseous guests make extreme heights impossible to beat without any exploits, although feel free to prove me wrong. With exploits though, it's as easy as ever. Like I mentioned before we did Amity Airfield, the queue line trap still works the same, so you can easily trap thousands of guests in a single queue line and beat it that way. There are two other scenarios where guests prefer more extreme rides, Adrenaline Height and Wacky Waikiki. Since Adrenaline Heights is from RCT 1, there is no first aid stall available, so you will have to trap them using some other exploit like the queue line trap. That works in Wacky Waikiki as well, but there you can also use the first aid stall. Okay, so that's all the scenarios with guest goals, but what about other ones? Any scenario with a park value goal is not a problem, as the guests are not important here. Park value is still super easy to cheese, and even if you're not cheesing it, you can just make the money by charging more than €6 for very new rides with low enough stats for the guests to ride them. If it's a park where you charge for the park entry, then making money is barely impeded at all, as they'll still pay the same to enter. For this reason, coaster building scenarios are also not a problem, as you can take as long as you like to make the money needed to afford them. That only leaves the ones where you need to make a certain amount of money from rides or stalls. The ones for rides are easy. We have seen before that getting to 3000 guests with a normal park is perfectly doable, and then you just spam small rides, charge something like $5 a ride and you'll be fine. The only stall profit scenario in the game, Bumbly Bazaar, is also not a problem, as you can win that by just selling a few umbrellas, so not being able to sell food and drinks doesn't matter. And that proves that you can still beat every scenario in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 and 2 if all the guests are super nauseous all the time. And for every single one of them, except the few where guests prefer more intense rides, you don't even need to trap guests in any way and can beat it with a normal park. I hope you didn't get nauseous while watching this sick video, unlike those poor guests that totally deserve it. If you like watching me bully the peeps, click here to see what happens if they cannot ever be happy. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.